Hi, I'm Gareth. I hope you're really well. I certainly am, thank you very much for asking. And welcome to this blog. I'm going to be talking about different kinds of errors and the use of suspense accounts. So my name is Gareth John. I'm a Managing Director with First Intuition, one of the UK's premier accountancy training colleges. You've got my contact details there, garethjohn@fi.co.uk. Welcome to drop me an email if there's anything you want to ask me. I also am quite active on social media. You might see me on Facebook or Twitter. In fact, my Twitter handle is AAT Top Tutor. So you're welcome to follow me. I sometimes post links to relevant online lectures and I answer questions. You can more than welcome to get in touch with me. As I said, I act as Managing Director for First Intuition, and I also act as a tutor, and I help students out with our distance learning programme. Over the last few years, we've been very pleased. We, I think, are the only college in the UK to win College of the Year 3 times in a 5-year period, which we were extremely proud of. I was particularly tickled to be awarded the UK Lecturer of the Year in 2011 based on nominations from some of my students, which was very touching. And more recently, in 2013, we were nominated for Study Resource of the Year, so we're very pleased with how the last few years have gone for us. So, let's get to the question we're going to analyse in this blog. So, we're looking here at a trial balance has been extracted, so maybe at the end of the period, they've balanced off each of the ledger accounts in their nominal ledger, so they've balanced off ledger accounts for things like cash, things like sales, various expenses. They'll have taken the resulting balance from each ledger account, listed them in a trial balance, so appropriate ones on the debit side, appropriate ones on the credit side. Now the trial balance, the whole point is the trial balance should balance. So when you do that process of comparing the debit and the credit side, you're hoping you've got the same result, but sometimes you won't. And in this case, the debit side had £50,000 in total on it. The credit side only totaled £49,540. Now, the fact that the trial balance doesn't balance means there must have been at least one error at some point during the year, because every single double entry you post should balance. So every single double entry should have the same amount on the debit side as on the credit side. So in theory, it shouldn't matter if you're posting one double entry in a year or 10 million double entries. No matter how many you're posting, the totals of the debits should always equal the total of the credits. If they don't, there's a problem. Now, even at this stage, we can consider where the suspense account would have to be. If I imagine how the trial balance might look, there'd be various ledger account balances on the trial balance. So we would have maybe assets such as cash, motor vehicles, computer equipment, for instance, even the sales ledger control account. They would all be on the debit side of the trial balance. We would have entries like capital and liabilities like loans would be on the credit side of the trial balance. Your income, so the sales you've made to customers, that would also be on the credit side. Various expenses like telephone, purchases, expenses, they would sit on the debit side. So we'd have balanced up and listed all of the debits, all of the credits, and in a full trial balance you could have dozens upon dozens, possibly even hundreds of account balances being listed, depending on the size of the organisation. What we're told is that the debit side totaled £50,000, the credit side only totaled £49,540. So there's been a problem, obviously, during the year, which we'll need to identify and correct. Now, to start with, we need to actually put the suspense account on. And I always think that the suspense account, its job really is to temporarily balance up the trial balance. So the suspense account will always go on the lower side. Now here, if you imagine, I always think of a set of scales when I'm dealing with accounting. If I've got a set of scales, the scales should balance. So how much do I need to add to the scales to make them balance? Well, I'm going to need to add, in this case, a suspense account on the credit side, because the credits were lower. We're going to need to add a suspense account onto the credit side. And effectively, I want to get the credit side to actually equal 50,000. So how much will I need to add on to the credit side? Well, if you do 50,000, deduct the 49,540 you've already got there, I think I'm going to need to add on 460 as the suspense account, and it'll be on the credit side of the trial balance, just to make the two columns temporarily balanced. And this is the key thing about a suspense account. It indicates there's been an error. So it's a temporary account while I find out what the error is, and hopefully once I've dealt with the error, then we will have eliminated and cleared that suspense account. So bear in mind there's no place in your final accounts for a suspense account. The whole point is we should look to get rid of it. Now I've identified that I want to set up a credit for the suspense account, and you can imagine a suspense account very much just a ledger account or a T account like any other ledger account. So if I want to set it up on the credit side, I would start with a balance brought down on the suspense account of my 460. So that's the first step, is to identify how much the suspense account is, which is just the difference between the two totals, but importantly making sure you recognise which side it needs to be on. The mistake sometimes students make is they'll look at the two original figures and they'll think, the debits are bigger, there must be something extra on the debit side. Well, remember the suspense account, the whole point of it is to balance up the columns initially. So we've got a balance brought down on the suspense account of £460 on the credit side. Well, that indicates there's been at least one error, one problem in what we've done during our accounting period. And in fact, we're told in the task that we've actually got 6 errors. 6 errors that we've identified and that we're going to have to deal with. Now, the thing to be a bit careful about here is not all of these errors will necessarily affect the suspense account. You will sometimes make errors in your financial records that don't create a suspense account. And let's imagine why. Well, the suspense account arose because the two columns in the trial balance didn't balance. The debit total and the credit total were not the same. That's why the suspense account arose. So it's only errors that cause the two columns to not balance that will therefore create a suspense account. Basically, if you ever post a double entry that doesn't balance, if you post a double entry where the total of the debits doesn't equal the total of the credits, that would cause a suspense account. You could, though, post errors where they do balance. You could post a double entry that does balance, it's just the wrong double entry, and whilst that is an error in your accounts, it won't actually create a suspense account. So one of the things we're going to have to be a bit careful about here is identifying which errors will have caused at least part of the suspense account and which errors actually won't have affected the suspense account. Well, let's have a look at the first of our errors. So we've got payment of, and it's a £200 telephone bill. So we've paid a telephone bill to our telephone company. Now, they've posted a debit of £200 to the purchases account and a credit of £200 to the cash account. Now, I suppose the first thing I'll just note there is there's a debit of 200 and a credit of 200. So before I even worry about where they've made those postings to, can you see that is a balancing double entry? They have got a debit, they have got a credit, and they're for the same figure. So in fact, this error, although we're going to see it is an error, won't have actually caused the suspense account. This error will not have caused an imbalance on the trial balance. Well, let's identify now what the actual problem was. So what have they done? Well, they've debited the purchases account. Now, purchases is specifically when you're purchasing materials, stock, inventory from a supplier that you plan to sell on to your customers. So for instance, if you're a sandwich shop, your purchases would be purchases of bread, cheese, ham that are then going to go into the sandwiches that you sell to your customers. A telephone bill is not therefore purchases. So they've actually posted the debit to the wrong category. The credit, on the other hand, is going to the cash account. I think that's okay because if you're paying money out of your bank account, it doesn't matter if it's for a telephone bill or for purchases or for anything else. If you're paying money out, that's reducing your cash and we would be therefore crediting the cash account. So I think the error here is that they've debited the wrong account. They've debited the purchase account rather than the telephone account. Now, how are we going to deal with this and how are we going to correct the error? Because the question ultimately asks me for the correcting journals for each error and showing that the suspense account that we've set up would be eliminated. Now actually the suspense account is not going to be affected by this error, because remember the original double entry did balance, but I still need to come up with a correcting journal to solve that problem. So how am I going to do that? Well, the approach I tend to take when I'm looking at errors is I like to go through a three-step process of looking at firstly, what double entry did they post? What was the wrong double entry? Secondly, what double entry should they have posted? So what would have been correct? And then by comparing what they did to what they should have done, I can normally identify the correcting journal that will actually solve the error. So let's have a think here. So we were told that they debited purchases by 200 and they credited cash or bank by the same 200. That's what they posted. Now, as we've said, that is indeed a balancing double entry. They have posted a debit and a credit for the same value. So in fact, this error will not affect the suspense account. What should they have done? Well, they should have debited the telephone expense. They basically posted the debit to the wrong account. So they should have debited that by 200, and actually they should have credited cash by 200, because it doesn't matter whether you're paying for purchases or paying a telephone bill, that's still a reduction in your cash asset. Now, if I compare those two double entries, well, can you see that on the credit side, they're okay, because they should have credited cash, and they did credit cash. So actually, I don't need to do anything to cash. The problem is going to be on the debit side. They debited purchases. That's incorrect, so I need to get rid of that. Well, how do you get rid of a debit? Well, you get rid of a debit with a credit. So I think they're going to credit the purchases account by 200 to effectively cancel the original incorrect entry. And we then need to put it into telephone. So I will debit the telephone expense, effectively what they should have done in the first place, by the 200. Now, the key thing to make sure with your correcting journals is every correcting journal should be, as with any double entry, a balancing double entry where the debits and the credits equal. And here I've got a debit to the telephone expense of 200, credit to purchases of 200. That's my correcting journal. And you'll notice it doesn't impact on the suspense account. There's no entry there to the suspense because the original double entry balanced. Now, a couple of additional techie bits we can discuss about this particular error. What kind of error are we dealing with here? Well, this is what's known as an error of commission. It's an error of commission. In this case, effectively, we've just commissioned the wrong ledger account. The debit went to purchases when it should have gone to the telephone expense. Thing is, though, here is that whether it goes to purchases or telephone, either of them are actually an expense of the business. So you can imagine, even if they had posted the debit to the purchases expense, actually your profit at the end of the year would still be correct. You'd just be showing some cost in the wrong expense category. So this is an error of commission, where we've posted to the wrong ledger account. It's not as serious as an error of principle. An error of principle would be where your error is so severe that it would actually affect things like your level of profit and the figures on the net assets of the balance sheet. So this is an error of commission. And just to think about a bit of terminology you sometimes see in assessments, they sometimes ask whether errors will be disclosed by the trial balance. Now, it doesn't mean that the trial balance is going to sidle up to you and whisper in your ear. All it means is, will we be able to spot the error when we look at the trial balance? And if you remember, the original double entry here did balance, so the trial balance would still balance. There'd be no need for a suspense account. So in fact, this error would not be disclosed by the trial balance. You can imagine you could draw up your trial balance quite happily, and based on this single error, it would still balance. It wouldn't look like there were any problems, so you could be forgiven perhaps for even having missed that error. But the problem was that we've miscategorised an expense, haven't we? We've shown a telephone expense as a purchaser's expense. The trial balance will still balance. The profit at the end of the day will still be correct, but you'd actually have two figures that were slightly wrong. Okay, so that's our first error, looking at the miscategorization of a telephone bill as purchases there. Well, what about our second error? So we've now got some cash purchases, so £400 worth of cash purchases. Now, they were posted as a debit of 400 to the purchase account and a credit of 40 to the cash account. And again, if we start by literally looking at what they've posted, there's a debit of 400, a credit of only 40. So in fact, the double entry they posted did not balance. If that double entry did not balance, the trial balance would not balance. So this error is going to have had an effect on the suspense account. This error would be disclosed by the trial balance. Because of this error, the trial balance wouldn't balance. Well, let's go back and see if we can use my three-step approach of what they did, what they should have done, and how we can therefore correct it. Well, what did they do? Well, they debited the purchases account, or purchases expense, by 400. They credited cash incorrectly by only 40. And we can see that that double entry doesn't balance. What they should have done, well, they should have debited the purchases by 400. I think they should have also credited the cash by 400. If that's the amount you spent on these cash purchases, that's the amount that should have been brought out of the cash account. Now, if I then compare those two double entries, can you see that on the debit side, they did debit purchases 400. They should have debited purchases 400. So actually the purchases side is fine. They've recognised the correct expense. The problem's on the cash side. They've credited by 40 when they should have credited by 400. You see that they've credited far too little to the cash account. So I think to correct, they're going to need to credit the cash by another chunk. And the chunk is basically going to be the difference. Because they've already put 40 to the credit in cash, it should have been 400. I think they're going to need to credit cash by an extra 360. Basically topping up the credit to cash to what it should have been in the first place. So I've used the difference between the 400 and the 40. Well, where's the debit going to go? Well, I don't need to do anything to purchases, remember. Well, where's it going to go, therefore? Well, bearing in mind that the original double entry didn't balance, that would have created at least part of the suspense account. Now, if you remember, the suspense account is always added onto the side that's too small. And initially, the credit side was too small. We only credited 40 to cash. So the suspense for just this error on its own, you would have had 360. If you imagine there'd have kind of been a 360 on the credit side to make that balance up to the 400. We now want to eliminate that. So we're going to be debiting the suspense by 360, effectively eliminating the suspense that this individual error would have created, because we're now eliminating the error. So I think my balancing double entry to correct this error is to debit the suspense by 360, credit the cash by 360. Now what that does mean is I can start thinking about how the suspense account is now being cleared and eliminated. When we originally set up the suspense account, we thought it was going to be a credit balance of 460. Well, we've just said that we're now going to post a debit. So if I write number 2, because this is error number 2, the other side is being posted to cash, and we've got 360 as the posting to the suspense. Now you can see that has gone some way to clearing the credit balance of 460, but it doesn't clear it entirely. So it's obvious that that one error alone is not the only problem in the suspense account. There must be other things that have affected it, but at least I've made a bit of a start on getting rid of that suspense account. Okay, so third error. Well, we had a receipt of £500 from a cash sale. That was posted as a debit of 500 to the cash account and a credit of 500 to the sales ledger control account. Let's start by identifying what the double entry was. So we debited 500 and credited 500. So in fact, albeit that there was an error, the double entry they posted did balance. This is therefore not going to cause part of the suspense account. This error would not be disclosed by the trial balance because they did post a balancing double entry. But what's the problem? Well, they debited the cash account. Now, I think that's fine because they received some cash, so we debit the cash account to show the increase in the asset. The problem is the credit side went to the sales ledger control account. Now, the sales ledger control account is what records the amount that credit customers owe you. Now, this was a cash sale. This was a receipt from a cash sale, so it's not from a credit customer. This isn't the same as a credit customer paying me money later. I think that credit should actually just have gone to the sales account. I should have just recognised the income on that transaction. So if we use my three-step process again, what double entry did they post? Well, they credited cash by 500. They then credited the sales ledger control account. They're effectively reducing the amount owed by credit customers. This wasn't a payment by credit customer, so they should have posted debit cash 500, credit just the sales account 500. They should have recognised the income on that. Now, if you compare those double entries, well, actually the debit looks fine. They did debit cash 500. They should have debited cash 500. The problem's on the credit side. Now, they credited the sales ledger control account. That was wrong. They shouldn't have done that. So to eliminate that credit, I think they're going to want to debit the sales ledger control account 500. And it should have been a credit to sales. That's the bit they didn't recognise. So now I can put in the credit to sales of 500. And again, you'll notice my correcting journal is a balancing double entry. And in this case, doesn't require any impact on the suspense account because the original double entry did balance. This does not affect the trial balance. Now, in terms of what sort of error this was, now remember, error 1 we described as an error of commission because they just put the amount to the wrong expense account, but actually the profit would have still been okay. This is actually a more serious problem because they credited the sales ledger control account, which is actually an asset on the balance sheet, when they should have credited sales, which is income on the P&L. Now, in some respects, it's a similar error to the first one. They've put the amount to the wrong ledger account, but this is more serious because they've credited an asset account rather than crediting income. This would change the profit for the year and would also change the balance of the balance sheet. This, therefore, is an error of principle. Errors of principle, I think, of as being more serious than errors of commission because it will ultimately affect things like your profit and your net assets. However, as we've identified in the correcting journal there's no impact on the suspense account. Well, what about error number 3? So, the posting of interest paid of £300 was reversed. Now, reverse just means they posted the double entry the wrong way round. And what you've got to be careful about here is, unlike the first 3 errors, it hasn't actually specifically told me what the double entry they posted was. We'll actually be expected to work that out for ourselves because we should identify what posting interest paid would be, and we should be able to therefore work out what the reversal would be. Well, when I come to my 3-step process, what double entry did they post, what double entry should they have posted, and how would I therefore correct it? For this one, I'm actually going to start with the double entry they should have posted, because we know it's interest paid. So what should they have posted? Well, they should have debited the interest paid ledger account. That's effectively an expense. You can imagine if you pay interest to the bank, that's an expense, a bit like if you pay rent or if you pay salaries. So they should have debited interest paid 300, and they should have credited the cash account 300. If you pay interest, that's money coming out of your bank account. So that's what they should have done. Well, if they reversed it, it just means they got it exactly the wrong way round. So presumably they must have debited cash by 300 instead of credited it, and they must have credited interest paid by 300 instead of debited it. So they just got it exactly the wrong way round. So how are we going to correct it? And this is where you've got to be very, very careful, because we're saying that they did debit cash 300, so they've actually increased cash as an asset, which is wrong because we paid cash out. So they've debited cash by 300 when they should have credited cash by 300. Now, in order to make the correcting journal, what you can imagine is I've got to eliminate the original debit they posted, so that would require a credit of 300. They've then also got to put in the credit they should have had there in the first place. So I think that to correct the cash, we're going to need to credit cash by a full 600. The mistake students tend to make here is they'll just post a 300 correcting journal, when actually you need 600. Effectively, you need to cancel the original debit they did post and then put in the credit they should have posted. You see, we kind of need to post double the amount here. And then a similar idea for the interest paid, because they credited it by 300 when they should have debited it by 300. So again, I need to get rid of the original wrong credit, which would require a debit, and then we've got to put in the debit they should have had in the first place. So I think we're going to debit interest paid by 600 as well. Again, by double the amount, because we've got to eliminate the original incorrect credit and then put in the debit that should have been there in the first place. So I think my correcting journal there is going to be debit interest paid by 600, credit cash by 600. Yet again, a nice balancing double entry. Just make sure your correcting journals are always balancing double entries. But again, you can see, doesn't require an impact on the suspense account, because the original incorrect double entry, it was the wrong way around, but it did balance, didn't it? They did have a corresponding debit and credit entry in their double entry. So that error would not have been disclosed by the trial balance. That's a reversal. That's literally the kind of error you've got there. Well, fifth error, so we've got interest received of £50, so maybe we've got a bit of money in our bank account, we've received some interest, was posted as a debit to the interest paid account and a debit to the cash account. Now the first thing to see here is they've posted a debit on both sides, no corresponding credit, so this double entry they've posted clearly is not going to balance. I reckon therefore this error will have affected the suspense account. This error would be disclosed by the trial balance. If you post two debits with no credit, then ultimately the trial balance isn't going to balance. Now notice here it doesn't specifically tell us how much they've debited on each of the two accounts. However, if they don't tell you something is specifically wrong, I'd assume they did it right. So I'm going to assume here they have posted the 50 in each of those. So in terms of the double entry they did post, well, they debited interest paid and actually also debited cash. No corresponding credit side, so that isn't a balancing double entry. Well, what should they have done? Well, if they've received interest, that should be an increase in their cash. So I think they should have debited the cash by 50, but actually the credit should have gone to interest received. They should have posted a credit for the interest received of 50. You can see that they've recognised a debit to interest paid instead of a credit to interest received. Now if we compare their double entry in terms of what we need to do to correct, well, let's be careful here. Well, they debited cash 50 when they should have debited cash 50, so the cash side is fine. I don't think I need to do anything to cash. However, they debited interest paid. That was wrong. This isn't interest paid, it's interest received. So if they've debited interest paid, they should credit interest paid to get rid of it. So I think credit interest paid by 50 to effectively get rid of that debit that they wrongly posted. We also now need to recognise the credit to interest received. So I've got to show that. It's effectively a form of income. So we've got to now credit interest received by 50. Well, initially that's making it look like I'm trying to post a double entry that doesn't balance. I've got two credits, but the trick is where the debit's going to be. If you look back at their original double entry, the original double entry, if you remember, was two debits of 50 with no credit. Now that would have created a suspense account, and in fact it would have created a suspense account on the credit side. Remember, the suspense is always added to the lower side. That would have created a suspense of 100 on the credit side, which I now need to eliminate. Well, how do you eliminate a credit? You eliminate a credit with a debit. So I think now I need to debit the suspense by that 100. And in fact, you can now see my correcting journal does balance. I've got a debit of 100 and two credits of 50 each, totaling therefore 100. So that's my balancing journal to correct this error. And you can see it does have an impact on the suspense account. We're now debiting the suspense by this 100. So if I go back to my suspense account, we're now looking at error 5, aren't we, which is to do with interest. And we now want to post a debit to the suspense of 100. Now at the moment this is looking like I've probably now finished off the suspense account because we had the balance brought down, the 460 we originally needed to set up. Can you see I've now got a total of 460 on the debit side? So I'm reckoning that I'm probably there with my suspense account, but let's deal with the final error before we confirm that. Well, our final error, the sixth error, purchase of a motor vehicle for £1,000. That was posted as a debit of £1,000 to the motor expenses account and a credit of £1,000 to the cash account. Well, first thing I can identify is that they've debited £1,000 and credited £1,000. So they have posted a balancing double entry. It's not correct, but they have posted a balancing double entry. So I don't think this error will have affected the suspense account. This error would not be disclosed by the trial balance. But how are we going to go about actually correcting this error? Well, one more time, let's go through my what double entry did they post, what double entry should they have posted, and therefore how can I correct their error? Well, what did they do? Well, they debited motor expenses and credited cash, each for £1,000. So in fact that double entry does balance, hence no impact on the suspense account. Well, why is that wrong? Well, this £1,000 was actually to buy a motor vehicle. That's an asset of the business, a car or a van or something. That's an asset of the business, not an expense. Motor expenses would be for things like petrol, for instance. You know, that's an expense that will be recognised in the P&L for that period. If you buy a vehicle, that's an asset that's going to be recognised on the balance sheet. So I think what they should have done is debited motor vehicles, an asset account, and credited cash. So again, they've actually just posted the debit to the wrong account. They've posted it to an expenses account instead of an asset account. In fact, I think this is again an error of principle. You can imagine if you're recognising an expense instead of an asset, that will firstly impact on the profit you're showing on your P&L, will also affect the net asset value on the balance sheet. And how are we going to correct? Well, if you compare those double entries, they did credit cash when they should have credited cash, so I don't think I need to do anything with cash, but they debited motor expenses. That's incorrect, so how can we get rid of that debit? Well, I reckon I'm going to credit motor expenses by £1,000. So it's effectively eliminating that debit that we wrongly posted, and we now need to show the debit to motor vehicles where it should have been in the first place. This is an asset, not an expense. So in fact my balancing double entry will be debit motor vehicles £1,000 to show the asset that we've acquired, credit motor expenses to get rid of the debit we had recognised. So that's my correcting journal. Again, that doesn't affect the suspense account because the original incorrect double entry did at least balance. Well, I've now come up with correcting journals for each of the 6 errors. I'm hoping you can see how useful my did, should, correct approach is. I've used that for nearly 20 years now myself. So what double entry did they post? What double entry should they have posted? And compare the two to work out how you're going to make a correction. And then the final thing is just to check that we have eliminated the suspense account. Now, of the 6 errors, only 2 of them we reckoned actually affected the suspense account. The other 4 errors, although they were wrong, at least the double entry did balance. So hopefully at this stage what we should find is that when you balance off the ledger account, well, you should find that they balance off exactly without any need for a balancing figure, basically meaning that we have now cleared the suspense account, because remember it only ever was a temporary errors account whilst we worked out what had gone wrong and made the appropriate corrections. Whew! Well, thank you very much for your attention. I hope that's gone some way to deciphering the different sorts of errors you might come across and how to correct them, and particularly the use of a suspense account there. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll maybe see you on the next one. Thank you very much.